So the second invitation is the invitation to follow. And one of your lead statements, and I think a great one, is that it's leadership that gets all the airtime and press these days. That certainly is true. And another statement I loved, you suggested replacing the cliche that great leaders are made and not born with great leaders are reborn in order to be made followers. I love that. Can you talk about that for a minute?
I've thought a lot about this because there is such a raft of books about leadership, and there's magazines about leadership, and everybody wants to be a leader, and we're training in the church, training up leaders.
Right.
And I've found, at least in the parishes I've worked in, not everybody wants to lead, and sometimes we're pushing them, don't you want to be trained to be a leader? And then there are other people who really want to lead. They may not even have any gifting or emotional maturity for it, but they want it.
Right.
And so part of it, for me, came out of this, well, what does the church really need, and what does Jesus really want?
Yes.
And you see that his first invitation is to follow, to the disciples, come follow. And his last invitation to Peter is, well, you follow me.
Yes.
And that Jesus doesn't talk about leadership except one time where he talks about the Gentiles lorded over you. But if you take a broad view of Scripture and just look up in the concordance how many times you see the word follow, and how many times you see the word lead or leadership, or the number of times for follow is hundreds. Very
disproportional.
Hundreds of times.
Yes.
So as I thought about following, I thought, you know, there are places I would rather lead just because following can be so difficult. And I think we've underrated the difficulty of being a follower. Because if you're driving through Boston, would you rather be the lead car or the follower car? Because I might say, well, Steve, you lead, but then you go through the red light, you do something, and I have to follow.
Right.
And that can put me in a difficult position. And I have to pay more attention, I have to be humble about taking your lead. And it seems to me the character of a follower is much more in line with what Jesus is talking about. And whenever the disciples sort of try to get into the who's going to sit on your right and left, and are we going to be, it's a mess.
Yeah.
If they would stay in the place of following, then they're open, they're teachable, they're ready to turn on a dime and not attached to. But this is the way we're going, charge.
Yeah, that's well said. I wonder, Adele, if in another way, I agree with what you said, but I wonder if in another way of looking at it, it may be that we've actually, maybe instead of underestimating the difficulty of following, maybe we actually understand it intuitively, and that we avoid it like the plague.
Oh, that could be.
One of the most striking experiences I had a few years ago was I was privileged to be in a circle with a number of very stellar Christian leaders. These were great men and women, and they were all very successful, very kind of primetime leaders. And one of the questions that was asked by the facilitator of this little time that we had together was, "What are you reading?" And we went around that circle, and everybody shared what they were reading. And I tell you, so there was probably a dozen very significant leaders there. Every single human being in that group, everything they listed was something from the Wall Street Journal's business reading list. Not a single book on the spiritual life, not a single book on theology, not a single book on prayer. I just thought it was, I still don't know exactly what to make of that, and I certainly don't want to judge. These were really fine Christian people. But it struck me, there was this strong preference for secular management. You know, we don't poo-poo all that. I mean, there's grace there. But so I wonder, if sometimes our avoiding isn't somewhat intentional.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
And I think that our fascination with the business model, where leadership is everything. It's the CEO at the top that's going to make $1 kajillion. And that sense comes back into the church
Yeah.
as the best practices
Yes.
of the business world
Yes.
become the best practices of the church.
Yes.
Which is the cart before the horse. It's the
Right.
wrong, it's making Jesus going into the temple and saying, you've turned this into a marketplace.
Right.
It's having something else lead.
Yes.
Rather than this place of hearing the voice of God deep
Yeah.
within.
Well, I think you've written a really important book.
Oh,
I loved it.
thank you.
I think it's really valuable. And it's obviously, it's not just leaders that are invited to follow.
That's right.
A statement I'd like to bring us to the end of our discussion with is, you said, God's invitations are meant to mend, shape, anchor, and grow us into the character of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And some of the invitations that you proceed to unpack in the book, and I want to mention them, are to practice the presence of people. I love that little play on the historic book by Brother Lawrence, I assume. The invitation to rest, the invitation to weep. Now, I wouldn't have expected that, but that was a powerful chapter. It's one we wouldn't have predicted, perhaps. The invitation to admit I might be wrong. I expect that's an invitation a lot of us are not even for. The invitation to forgive, the invitation to wait, the invitation to pray, the invitation to remember, and then par excellence, the invitation to the most excellent way, which is really, of course, what we're really being called to more than anything, is to walk in love. Right. And to receive the grace from God that'll help us to do that. But it's a cooperative grace. It's a listening grace. It's a yielding grace, but it's not passive.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's well said.
Adele, thanks so much for giving us a truly fantastic book. All right, so the book is Invitations from God by Adele Calhoun. It's 11 chapters, just under 200 pages. Great reading. Every chapter has an invitation from God, a relevant scripture pertaining to that invitation, a discussion of the roadblocks that we can expect to encounter as we endeavor to follow God into that invitation, awareness of what's going on in our own hearts as we grapple with the implications of following God and these invitations, and suggested spiritual practices and disciplines to help us to respond to God's invitations. And at this point, I can't help but mention your wonderful book, which I regard as essential reading. I really do tell pastors it's an essential reading, and that's your Spiritual Disciplines Handbook. I would love it if you'd come back and we could have a discussion about that sometimes. Invitations from God by Adele Calhoun. It's an InterVarsity book from their Formatio series. I recommend it. Adele, thanks for being here. It's been great.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Steve.